Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on limiting Russia's capacity to wage wars 2 years into the invasion. I see we have folks filtering in now, but in the interest of time, we have a lot to discuss, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to start off, to let you know a little bit about us, at the Institute for Financial Integrity, we work to empower the professional community to protect the global financial system through cutting-edge research, education, and training. So it's very encouraging to see so many of you joining from all around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. We appreciate that you're all taking the time out of your day to come together to share knowledge, and we hope you gain value from today's discussion. 2 years ago, Russia launched a full-on invasion of Ukraine, illegally annexing Ukrainian territory and resulting in an unprecedented level of cooperation among world powers to stop Russian aggression and hold Russia accountable for the attack. As a result, Russia today is the most sanctioned country in the world, with more than 18,000 designations imposed on it by countries such as the United States, the UK, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, France, Australia, and the EU. In today's webinar, we will discuss this unprecedented cooperation imposing sanctions and strategic trade controls on Russia, efforts to limit Russia's access to resources, the effectiveness of those efforts, and possible ways to improve not just the work to reduce Russia's ability to wage war, but also compliance programs, which are a critical tool in those efforts. With us today are our two esteemed panelists, Nicki Kenyon and Pavel Verkhniatsky. Nicki is an associate managing director at the Institute for Financial Integrity with a background in the U.S. intelligence community and risk management in the private sector. She is a U.S. Army veteran who was born in Ukraine and came to the United States as a child. Pavel is an industry expert who is a managing partner at COSA Intelligence Solutions, an international corporate intelligence company with headquarters in Ukraine and presence around the world. He has a boots-on-the-ground view of not only what is happening in Ukraine as Russia continues to attack cities and civilian infrastructure, but also of Russia's efforts to evade sanctions and other restrictions. Prior to establishing COSA, Pavel worked as a risk analyst, building knowledge of the country risks in Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. He also conducted sophisticated integrity due diligence tasks on financial and industrial groups in the region. On request of international businesses and European embassies, he also monitored and analyzed the economic and political activities inside Russia and its foreign policy, as well as in Central Asia and the Caucasus, building a strong knowledge of the region. Pavel is an invited lecturer for several educational and training programs for members of supervisory boards, compliance officers, investment managers, and law enforcement agencies, including training programs of the Corporate Governance Professional Association, CRDF training on emerging technology investment risk, Council of Europe trainings on AML and CFT, and others. So you can see we're very grateful Pavel was able to join us today from Kiev and look forward to hearing the insights he'll be sharing with us all. Before we begin, just like to cover a few housekeeping items. Please note today's webinar is being recorded. We'll be sure to share the link with you to revisit or share with colleagues after the event's completed. We also encourage your comments and questions. You'll see a Q&A chat box on your screen. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar for us to address collectively. After the conclusion of today's discussion, you'll receive a follow-up email, including the link to the webinar recording, as well as exclusive early access to a new report on the subject for your reference. And now I will turn it over to Nicki and Pavel for what promises to be an informative discussion. Thank you both.
Thank you so much, and hi everyone. It's really great to have you here to discuss Russia, its full-on war on Ukraine, and the measures that have been taken during these past 2 years of a full-scale war. First thing I want to do is highlight a couple of recent developments, right? The UK's Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, or OFSI, as of October 2023, froze £22.7 billion in Russian assets since the invasion began. And we're talking about the invasion for, the last 2 years. Russia actually invaded and illegally annexed Crimea back in 2014. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about a 10-year war. The EU in 23 implemented its 10th, 11th, and 12th sanctions packages against Russia. OFAC and the US State Department together last week designated more than 550 individuals, vessels, and entities to mark the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also in response to the death of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny in an Arctic prison colony. OFAC has targeted Russia's financial infrastructure, including now the Mir national payment system and Russian banks' investments in fintechs. We targeted entities in third countries, including China, Serbia, and the UAE and Liechtenstein that are helping Russia. And OFAC is also targeting Russia's access to UAS, what I call UAS, unmanned aerial systems. So, we have all this stuff going on. The Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security also added more than 90 companies to the entity list last week. But here's the thing, though. The current sanctions landscape is more than a little daunting. Different sanctions, different restrictions, different jurisdictions, all aimed at limiting Russia's access to critical resources that allow Moscow to continue its war in Ukraine. So our discussion, as Lauren mentioned, will center on what's been done, how it's working, and how we can improve. So with that in mind, I want to welcome my co-host for this webinar, Pavel, whom I met virtually about more than a year ago now. And since then, I've become fascinated with his work and the company he created. So thank you, Pavel. Let's discuss first and foremost how effective sanctions and other restrictions have been so far against Russia. I'll highlight right off the bat that the goal, unlike media outlets will tell you, was not to crash Russia's economy, but to limit its resources and access to critical goods, technologies, machinery, and weapons. So, Pavel, have we been successful limiting those resources in your view?
Well, hi, Nicki, and hello, everyone. Yeah, and thanks for the introduction, for invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. Well, I can definitely say that we've been somewhat successful with the sanctions policy, and exactly for the reason that you just underlined. The idea is not to crush the Russian economy immediately. That's impossible. Everybody realizes that Russia has quite a significant resource, and it has some of the allies behind its back to support, with incoming critical goods as transition areas. Some of them are simply, some of those countries are simply redirecting Russia's oil and gas revenues from Europe to Asia. So it's clear that a country like that would not fall within several years. It will take a longer time, but the success lies in the fact that the sanctions policy has significantly slowed down the capability of Russia's military-industrial complex, for example, to gain critical components for its weapons. And the situation in the war zone, and basically the fact that the Russian missiles are falling on Ukraine in many different parts of the country these days, actually gives access to what's inside those missiles. And given the fact that we can see Western produced components in those systems, in those missiles, gives us an understanding what channels are supposed to be cut for the Russians to be less successful in their sadistic endeavor, basically running this war. So that's one thing. the sanctions policy slowed down their capacity to build weapons. That's simple as that. It has not prevented them from creating weapon systems at all, but I mean, for 100%, but it definitely slowed it down. And in this war, it's important how fast, in our case, how slow the Russians can reproduce the weapons they are losing in Ukraine. And if you look at the statistics, they're losing it in huge quantities. Many countries around the world together don't even have a part of that scrap that they have already lost in our country in this war. So that's one. Another success is actually decreasing the revenues from trade for Russia and increasing the cost of not any, but many transactions that the Russians are running around the world, and increasing the cost of certain products, critical goods they need for their economy, the technology they need to gain access to for even the oil industry, for example. That is, I can say that is a success because the more money they need to spend on developing their economy, developing their industries inside the country, the slower it goes, and in the end, it actually leads to degradation. It leads to stagnation, and this is, I think, this is a marathon. It's not a 2-year effort. Exactly.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And, Treasury just released an assessment about the effect of the oil price cap on Russia's oil revenues. And what they showed was that Russia's oil revenues are in fact down. And that was the whole point of this oil cap. It wasn't to stop the Russians from shipping oil. It was to keep the oil flowing globally. But at the same time, it was to reduce their revenues because, look, it was energy market participants, right? Analysts, and even like Russia's oil czar, they all agree that the rising discount on Russian oil is due to the oil price cap coalition's increased enforcement activities. So it is happening. And like you said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I will also add that, first of all, a lot of folks will point to the fact that Russia's GDP is growing, right? Yes, it's growing. But at the same time, wartime economies are pretty much always robust. And around 40% of the government budget is spent on the war. But once that war is over, what do you think is going to happen, right? My thought is that Russia needs this war to continue economic growth, which is likely part of the refusal to end it. I mean, am I wrong here?
Absolutely, absolutely correct. And it's basically insane from a perspective of a democratic state to see a country spending all of its efforts and all of its money, all of its human potential for a war effort. That's insane. Basically, this is not a long-term strategy for a country's development, right?
Yep.
Russia's been aggressive for centuries. We tend to forget about this from time to time, but they never forget to remind us about this. And we're just unlucky to live in the era when they suddenly decided to do this again. But despite this, or maybe even due to this aggressive foreign policy towards its neighbors, not only them, and you can see the hybrid threats and attacks basically all over the world on democratic states around the world. Russia is not actually developing properly. I remember times when I actually spent a lot of time in Russia, working there, living there for around 7 years, actually, before 2014. And I remember monitoring their economic situation, and basically they were telling their population every 1 or even 2 weeks that they are going to reduce their dependency on oil and gas, but it never happened. So they are still dependent on oil and gas. And now with the lack of investments into the country, which they actually had in quite good quantities before, in quite good volumes before the 2014 actually, and even after, before 2022, they had plenty of those investments into different technology fields, and but foreign investments mostly. And the oil and gas industry itself, which was also a bit more technological than it's now, they had all those successes. But now, I mean, they're losing their economic growth potential. What we see now, Nicki, is exactly what you said. It's a wartime economy, and the figures might be not as reflecting the reality if in the long term. And it's well, we can predict what's happening after these periods of time, and I believe that it's going to be another downfall for that country.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And then there's also, the isolation factor, right? So Russia's been booted from the Egmont group of financial intelligence units. The FATF suspended Russia's membership last year. So, they issued another statement on Russia on the date of the 2-year anniversary, acknowledging the UN General Assembly's resolution demanding that Russia immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its military forces from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Right? This is an isolation factor as well, and like the architect of the Russia sanctions program, who just came back to government service, Dalip Singh, he basically said, I think it was about a year ago, he said, look, we need to make Russia a pariah. And that's exactly what happened. Part of it was obviously Russia's fault. I mean, you invade a neighbor, people kind of don't like you. But at the same time, this is also a goal. The more you isolate them, the more difficult you make it for them to transact, to get proper resources, to improve their military, etc. So let's talk about the next kind of thing. We talked about some of the successes. Interestingly, I see a question from an anonymous attendee about impacting regular Russians. We talked about the Russian economy and that the purpose was not to crash it, right? So when Yulia Navalnaya met with Biden, she asked the US government not to punish regular Russians, but to focus on the leadership and war effort. The next day, the US sanctioned the Mir payment system, which, for those not familiar with it, is primarily a small value payment system for branded cards like Visa or MasterCard. Why was sanctioning Mir important to stopping Russia's military-industrial complex and not simply another measure making life difficult for regular Russians? Pavel, do you want to take that one, or do you want me to take it first?
Look, I'll pass this to you. I mean, commenting on Navalny's, declarations and statements, we shouldn't forget she's also working for the Russian population. So I'll be careful here, and I'll just pass it over to you on this one.
Okay. So the big thing is, yes, definitely stop the military, right? Definitely impede their efforts to improve their military. But at the same time, Russia is constantly trying to find ways to evade sanctions, and that includes processing payments and conducting transactions. So the goal was not to punish regular Russians, but to really make sure that we block Russia's ability to process payments and conduct transactions. Okay. I will say that, we can't cushion the impact to regular citizens always. We always try, When I was at Treasury, we talked about the secondary effects, the unintended consequences, the tertiary effects. How is this designation going to affect civilians? We always had those discussions, and we always tried to minimize that impact. Is that always going to work? No, it's not. But the goal really here is to talk about how do we prevent Russia from getting around these restrictions, which it's constantly trying to do. So let's talk about what was most successful real quick, and then we'll talk about the failures, because I love me some failures. So Pavel, what do you think was the most successful as far as preventing Russia's ability to wage war?
Right. We can name a lot of different things and from different kind of dimensions, like the price cap, the lack of investments, identifying the critical components they've been using in their weapons. Many of those things, they are truly successful. But what I think from a systemic point of view was successful is that we've revealed the network, the global network Russia is utilizing to circumvent sanctions. That is critical because right now, I think there has never been such a huge analytical resource involved in identifying sanction circumvention mechanisms, identifying entities and individuals involved in that evasion process. The countries and the mechanisms inside those countries letting Russia circumvent the sanctions, use their intelligence services, firms established around the world. They've been highlighted, so to say. So the biggest success, I guess, is revealing this network, understanding how this global mechanism works, and just highlighting how massive this is. And some of the mechanisms were sleeping, but some mechanisms started to be utilized and were introduced throughout the war. Russians are quite adaptive, unfortunately, and I think the biggest success is that the global kind of community involved in the sanctions policy, both government and non-governmental private players, they've joined forces, and I think are doing quite a good job in revealing this network that Russia is building or built, and constantly tracking the changes and how Russia adapts so that so that the mechanisms actually work. There's lack of enforcement these days, but that's a different thing. That is something that could be better.
Yeah, and let's, good transition there. Let's move on to the next topic. What could have been improved, right? The purpose of sanctions after Russia's full-scale invasion involved three dimensions, and I'm taking this from Dilip Singh's testimony last year. In the short term, maximize the costs on Putin for the continuation of the war. Over the medium term, degrade Putin's ability to exert influence and project power on the world stage. In the long term, generate a negative demonstration effect to other autocrats. So we're going to show you that being an aggressive jerk and invading your neighbors is not going to bode well for you. Going back to that first question, Russia's economy in crisis, I think, was kind of assumed because it's so hard to avoid. But as I said, wartime economies tend to be robust and a bit misleading as the economy mobilizes for war. So what is it that we can improve on? I will agree with you. I'll say enforcement of existing restrictions, trade controls, all that. We are improving, we're working on it, but there's more to be done. What else do you think can be improved, Pavel?
Well, I think we should start with a conceptual thing here. Many around the world see the sanctions policy as something, and the sanctions in general, as something technical. Some firms, businesses see this as something within the legal landscape. But let's finally understand that it's much more than that. It's a humanistic issue. So when the Russians use their intelligence services, their military, their agents around the world to acquire, for example, components for a missile from a respected U.S. company, right? Undermining the reputation of that company in the end. Well, unless that company didn't know about who's buying, right? But we'll get there, I think. When the Russian agents buy this component, right, they put it into the missile. The missile hits, no matter actually what it hits, it's an aggression. So even if it hits a military base, for example, and kills soldiers, those soldiers weren't soldiers all their life. They were teachers, artists, chefs, business people, whoever, and they were killed. Right? That is terrible. Sometimes those missiles hit residential areas. They kill people. They basically kill children. The statistics is terrible. According to some assessments, the Russians have killed over 150,000 people, of civilian people, in the city of Mariupol alone. So when that missile with that component from a respective company hits a human being in Ukraine, that is, in a way, complicity in a war crime. From the perspective of that, from the side of that company,
yeah, it's reputational damage. Yeah,
the component, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
So first thing we need to understand is that it's not just technical, it's not just legal. It has consequences that are basically human lives. Yeah. Second thing, more kind of practical, so to say, but I think everything should start with this understanding. In a practical way, we should definitely impose more secondary sanctions on the entities involved in circumvention, and they're more or less known. Yes, it takes time to kind of identify the mechanism, the schemes, the networks, but they're being identified. The methods are there. The methods are basically, usual investigative methods, enhanced due diligence methods that we use in corporate intelligence in our daily business operations. But also, there should be a significant improvement on the side of financial institutions, basically banks, financial monitoring and compliance, as most of the transactions wouldn't have happened if the banks were more diligent and more precise, more accurate with, and deep in what they're doing in terms of KYC and financial monitoring. So the criminals and the guys supporting Russian circumvention mechanisms are basically criminals, and they rely and they know how those simplified screening tools in banks work, because we all know a bank cannot spend 2 weeks on an enhanced due diligence on every counterparty, but there should be criteria, there should be specific approaches and ways to follow when it comes to Russian-related entities in high-risk countries like the UAE, Turkey, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Georgia, countries that have unfortunately showed themselves as the transition areas for Russian goods. So this has to be improved significantly as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of red flags that can lead to greater greater research. And if you check out the Institute for Financial Integrity at our website, We do articles on this all the time. We highlight strategies that you can use to, to research these red flags. I had an interesting question in the Q&A box, talking about, yeah, we don't want to target regular Russians, but why not just comprehensively sanction Russia? And I had an interesting discussion with some coworkers last week about that when OFAC released more than 500 designations along with the State Department, right? Why hasn't Russia been comprehensively sanctioned or embargoed? It would seem to be easier. So, a bank, financial institution, fintech sees Russia or sees something located in Russia. Nope, block. I mean, it seems easier than researching what you can and cannot do, right? And emotionally, you and I discussed this earlier, about an emotional reaction versus a practical one. I'd say emotionally, yeah, it's great. But embargoing the world's 11th largest economy is a bit more difficult than embargoing a country like North Korea or Iran or Cuba, which aren't as integrated into the world's financial structures. Disruptions to the global economy are more likely if countries such as Russia are comprehensively sanctioned. And given that Russia continues to export commodities such as fertilizer, energy, steel, removing them from the global market is going to impact not just Russia, but the global economy writ large. So I think what the global powers are trying to do is actually balance this. And again, somebody asked Nurul, thank you for your question. There's a lot of sanctions evasion going on. Do you think that's why Russia is doing well? Well, are they doing well? Again, we mentioned the wartime economy, but we also mentioned the fact that, they have bad access to machines, to technologies, and we keep limiting it more and more and more. So what do you think of that?
You know what, Nicki, I think this is a very good point, and there is a specific issue I think we need to discuss. So when we're limiting them in their access to modern technology, we should assume that they might try and develop that technology in country, which is a problem actually. It usually takes time, but copying technology, they have their other friends around the world who definitely know how to copy things, who could help them. So this might become a problem in the midterm, actually. So it's sometimes better to control the inflow of those, that technology, but not actually letting them create that technology in country by themselves. In this case, we should really pay attention to the scientists and tech specialists that they are sending around the world to conferences, to different educational institutions, scientific institutions. You should realize that most, if not every scientist traveling around the world these days, especially working in high tech and mil tech, etc., is related to the Russian intelligence. And this is also an area to explore. So while limiting their access to technology, to modern technology, we also have to limit their capability of developing that technology by themselves.
Yeah,
that's a big thing.
And I absolutely agree. But what they're doing by turning their economy toward wartime, and Kim asked a great question in the Q&A box about like what is their spending compared to the Cold War. I saw numbers that between 6 and 10% they're going to spend on their defense budget this year. During the Cold War, we saw 12 to 17%. So it's still less than the Cold War, but they're still approaching that. But it's something that we need to be aware of. Like what you said, Pavel, is 100% true. And this is what I teach a lot of my students is that, look, a red flag doesn't necessarily mean that a crime is happening, but a red flag is an indicator for you to do some deeper research. And, that it's exactly what you said. There's high risk activities, there's lower risk activities. You need to examine your own risk appetite, and you need to figure out whether this red flag indicates that you need more research into a particular topic or client or counterparty. So we discussed failures or what can be improved. I don't like to call them failures. Let's not call them failures. We briefly touched on Russia's evading trade restrictions and U.S. origin components ending up in Russian missiles. For example, I've seen recent reports that the Kenyon missile has almost no Russian parts, but rather these components are mostly made in the United States and are helping destroy Ukrainian cities. We just talked about this. We've seen reporting that Russia is going to use known transshipment companies to gain access to U.S. origin components. There was reporting recently that Russia and Uzbekistan are planning to create shell companies funded by Russia in Uzbekistan to purchase components for Russian UAS for evading sanctions. And the shell companies will be apparently funded by Moscow. So my question to you is, you run a corporate intelligence firm. What other methodologies are you seeing as the head of a company that performs due diligence research? And this was one of the questions that also somebody asked in the Q&A box. What are you seeing? What kind of sanctions evasion techniques are you seeing?
Well, the majority of those techniques are about intermediaries that are used to create several layers of companies between the producer of the goods and the Russian military-industrial complex. So that's the majority of those transactions. This is where enhanced due diligence is really useful, since the main idea here is identifying the ownership, identifying the real people behind the company involved in the mechanism, identifying the related entities and all the links the company has. And that is basically what enhanced due diligence is about, right? So you dive into the structure of the company, and most importantly, its ecosystem, because the structure can be quite empty, but then there is the ecosystem. There's plenty of trade data in the market these days accessible by due diligence specialists, and this really helps. This really helps understanding how products are moving, what companies are involved. So basically, customs trade data is quite important here. The owners and ultimate beneficial owners of the companies, which is a headache for banks usually, identifying the UBO. According to Ukrainian banks, 50% of companies, just besides the war, declare a false ultimate beneficial owner. So
Yep.
that is kind of tricky, right? So when you circumvent sanctions, you definitely use a proxy or whoever you use to mislead the bank checking your transaction, or misleading the producer. Moreover, producers of these components, for example, the big reputable companies that I'm not going to probably name this time, but everybody understands the microchips and all these things. They are selling their products often in bulk to distributors, to their certified distributors. Those distributors in their turn sell those goods to other smaller distributors, and then it can go wherever it goes. So we often see that, for example, components or even larger things like CNC machines, critically important things for the Russians to produce their missiles, not just maintain them, but produce the missiles. So these things are often sold either blindly, without clear understanding of who's the third party, who's the actual buyer, because the Russians are using these intermediaries. Or sometimes they might, I think, understand. I mean, a local, say, distributor in Turkey might understand who he's dealing with. He understands the logistics route, right? So it's critical for the due diligence experts to trace these things, even if the logistics route is not logical. This is a red flag already. I mean, there is also a lack of synchronization between the Russian and Belarusian sanctions, which is crucial because sometimes you might be selling something with a transit hub in Belarus with documents being, for example, in Kazakhstan. So by documents, the product should be going to Kazakhstan with a transition point in Belarus. If it's military-related goods, in many cases, if not all of them, this transition point is used only for the purpose of circumventing the sanctions, because it will go directly from Belarus to Russia. They have no border there, right? It's a union state. So these things have to be checked. There are simple things like even date of registration. You probably know the increase of export from such country as Armenia to Russia increased by nearly 500% from the beginning of the war, and it doesn't look like their trade relationship has become better, right? Or Armenia all of a sudden had more products to sell to Russia. This is clearly an indicator of circumventing sanctions and using Armenia as a transit zone to bring in goods into the Russian Federation. You can see plenty of things that can be identified only through human source intelligence, human as we call it, because unfortunately many of the evasion mechanisms mean that data will not be declared, right? And you might not always see the data even through the trade registries, because if it goes through a border between Kazakhstan and Russia, they might get they might have a certain agreement just not to put that data on the database. It's a human factor that can be easily influenced by the special services, for example, right? Or even on a political level. Not blaming anyone, but sometimes you need to use the human methodology to basically work through sources on the ground. Don't forget to do that legally, ethically, to understand the nature, which is critical here, the nature of the relationship between the company that is, for example, you're checking it as an intermediary wanting your goods, or you're a bank and you see that transaction going forward. So you might want to understand the relationship of that, or the nature of the relationship of that company to the Russian Federation or to the industry it declares it's working in. Because we see plenty of cases when the company was working in one industry and all of a sudden it turned to selling electronics, microelectronics, right? Which it never did. Yeah, that might be adapting to the business environment, but it is a red flag that has to be checked. Absolutely. I mean, the Russians in the ownership, that's critical. Their backgrounds, it's critical. The Russian name doesn't mean it's a circumvention mechanism by itself, but it's a red flag as well. You need to understand the background of the person and their place in the industry, in the business, whether anyone actually knows them, and from what perspective, right? That's also
what humans can provide.
Exactly.
And that's why being on the ground, you being in Ukraine, that's so great, because you can talk to these sources, you can talk to former employees, you can talk to current employees, you can find out, hey, who's your boss? This kind of stuff.
Nicki, in Ukraine, yes, but just we shouldn't think that most of the circumvention happens in Ukraine. Actually, this is the minimum where it happens. But our kind of in our case, in our company's case, the reach in the Middle East, in Turkey, and Central Asia, which is critical. This is where all the fun stuff happens, right? So this is where you need the sources on the ground. This is where you need to understand the ecosystem, the local specifics, how local information sources, registries work, so on and so forth. So mostly there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, you being over there is it's proximity. So it's actually closer to these different sources that you can use. Bottom line for firms and financial institutions, monitor these types of news and developments. Update your risk assessments often. Maybe you have a new client, right? A company that was just established this year in Uzbekistan. It exhibits some red flags, vague general lines of business, no available ultimate beneficial ownership information. And then you read a media story about, you know, these shell companies in Uzbekistan that are going to be, you know, that are going to be created by Russia. Maybe that's where you take a closer look. Maybe that's where you engage in some enhanced due diligence. Maybe a company like COSA, for instance. I was really, really impressed with a lot of the reports that they did. So yeah, absolutely. So let's go on to the next topic because we're coming up on time and there's so much to discuss. You know, we touched upon how these U.S. components are ending up in missiles targeting Ukraine. You know, what are we finding? Like what, you know, aside from what we already mentioned, which is transshipment, which is, you know, using third countries to ship components, is there anything that you're seeing that could be helpful for firms and financial institutions to take a look at?
Well, yeah, basically just the things I've mentioned. This is also a matter of export controls. You know, the U.S. regulations actually have certain limitations in terms of selling electronic components to Russia, China, Venezuela if the end user is a military related entity, right? So, but the enforcement isn't there. They just don't see how how this product travels. They don't see where it ends up, and this is where more focus has to be placed. But again, if directly answering your question, how these components end up in missiles, in Russian missiles, intermediaries, and one more time, intermediaries. All those networks, all those dodgy shell firms, all those screen firms that you simply don't see who's behind it. If you really want to see, there is always the capability to do that. It's just that companies sometimes close their eyes to that, and there are a lot of things that can be done. I'm just directly answering the question how they appear there through intermediaries in third countries.
No, and that's absolutely right. And I think we've done a bit on the enforcement side. You know, you've seen that guy Hans de Gietera in Belgium and his network, you know, arrested and charged. You've seen, you know, these guys in Brooklyn and the two Russian Canadians charged recently. So I think we're definitely doing things. And we need to do more of them. On the other side, firms, financial institutions, look at the family members, look at the close associates, look at the front end shell companies, look at the false shipping documents. You know, transactional monitoring. Are they shipping something, you know, are they shipping asparagus somewhere, you know, near Russia that's costing 5 times what asparagus normally costs? That could be a problem. Are you seeing, you know, anything that's interesting, that's a deviation from normal activity? That's where you need to look, right? So our next subject is, you know, looking toward the future a bit, right? We know Russia uses tried and true methods to evade sanctions. Risky sectors like electronics, gold, art, precious gems, those types of things. They'll use proxies to transact. Are you seeing anything interesting that you don't think is covered or you think is going to be on the horizon as we work to further restrict Russia?
Well, yes, basically, if you look at how the logistics, the sanctions, or kind of sanctions evasion logistics work, this is where they might be developing certain efforts using European countries, the Baltics, just to drop the goods and then smuggle them through the borders. That also happens, and this might happen further. I believe that, well, I'll give you an example of the logistics issues. When some of the military-related goods, like Shahed drones, for example, from Iran, are arriving by a special flight, Tehran, Moscow, and landing in a Moscow civil airport, because they've got problems with like their military airfields are currently overburdened.
Yeah.
So I hope the Patriots we have these days might help them slightly. But the aircrafts arriving with military goods in a civil airport in Moscow, for example, means that the airport, it definitely knows what's inside, right?
Yeah.
So this is also a point where the focus of the global community involved in sanctions can be placed, because the airport itself could be sanctioned. That is a critical thing to understand. Moreover, Russians will definitely, and they are already doing this, they will corrupt people around the world to make wrong decisions and close their eyes on certain issues. It might sound simple as hell, but they are doing that already, and they will continue doing that in despair, and understanding that their windows of opportunities are closing. And they will be developing their relationships with the global South countries, where they ideologically mislead the governments, many of which are actually autocratic regimes, and use them for their schemes and circumvention mechanism. That is very clear. The banking system, I believe, will be also targeted, and I'm not going too deep into the cyberspace, but in classic banking aspects, they might be using local currencies. They might be, which didn't work well, by the way, for them in an economic sense with the Indians, for example. But they might be still utilizing the banking system, the global banking system, for their benefit. And this is where we should actually remember FATF, which has not been able to blacklist Russia so far. And there is a huge discussion about that. There is a huge debate, which I think is actually, I believe that this issue is much simpler than we think. Some experts say that, for example, if Russia is blacklisted by FATF, but then India and China would keep on working with Russia as usual, this will significantly decrease the authority of FATF. Look, doesn't it actually reduce its authority by the fact that Russia is at the table and discussing financial monitoring mechanisms and AML, countering terrorist financing, non-proliferation, while trading with Iran and North Korea? I think this is weird in its sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, FATF can make recommendations, but obviously, having enforcement authorities is really up to each individual country. So, it's definitely like, yeah, you can see that. And, going on to the next topic real quick, because we have a ton of questions. I'm just shocked. I know the Ukrainian government did approach FATF several times about blacklisting Russia, and they still haven't done it, but they did release, the statement this year. How will Ukraine work further to limit Russia's resources to fight? Like, what else is Ukraine going to be doing?
Well, I invite everybody to look at the portal the National Agency on Corruption Prevention created. It's called War and Sanctions, available for everybody. They've got several interesting sections there. It's called Components in Weapons, where you can see, for example, a Kenyon missile or an Iskander missile, for example, and you can see all the components coming from different countries around the world used in that missile. So by raising that awareness, by making this public, I think Ukraine does well, to a certain extent, educational and awareness kind of plays an educational role here, and actually reveals who's behind the creation of a missile. Also, the Tools of War portal, which is also quite interesting. You can see the CNC machines for missile production supplied to Russia by some of the European countries, by the United States, and blindly or not, we don't know. But this is raising this awareness is critical. So Ukraine is, I believe, has established quite a good communication with our partners, with the allies, with the sanctions coalition in general, and the sanctions coalition in the EU, the UK, the United States. I think it coordinates its efforts quite well. But I think what Ukraine will be doing more is working with the global South countries in this regard, and revealing some of the issues that would be worth considering by those countries in regards to helping or not helping Russia evade sanctions. So our task is to expand the sanctions coalition, and it's not just asking countries to impose sanctions. It's a matter of, I wouldn't even be feared of this word, trade. So you give some benefits. You, like in the critical resource industry, for example, we can go deep there, but it's going to take us another hour. The titanium industry, or the rare earth minerals. You can find ways to find mutual interest, or the nuclear energy issues, with the countries currently working with Russia and currently helping them circumvent the sanctions regimes, and turn them towards the sanctions coalition based on certain economic benefits and mutually beneficial trade or industrial projects, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a lot to do.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to do. And, as we go on to the question and answer session, we have a ton of questions, which are really interesting, right? So, Lauren, can we keep this open a little bit longer so we can actually address some of the questions?
Yes, absolutely. We have a ton of questions that have come through, and, given the importance of the topic, I think we're all available to stay on for a little bit longer. If anyone needs to drop, we understand, and we will be sharing the link to the recording afterwards. You can take a peek and see if your question's in there and the answer. So we'll just go ahead and then start rolling through some of these questions that have been submitted.
Yeah, I think that's great. The one question that's been asked, and Pavel, I hope you can stay on for a few more minutes. You can, right?
Sure, for sure.
I'm going to just put you on the spot right there. So a couple of questions rolled in about secondary sanctions. So I want to address those a bit. They are a very powerful tool, right? After EO 14114 was signed, banks in Russia, Turkey, and the UAE and in China got a bit nervous, right? We've seen reporting that they started to limit their Russia exposure. So the secondary sanctions are very, very specific. And I want to make sure that you guys understand this. They are a powerful tool because they're scary, right? So if you do business with Russia's military, you are going to face US sanctions. And there doesn't have to be a US nexus. There doesn't have to be use of the US dollar. There doesn't have to be a US person involved. If your bank or your financial institution or your firm does business with Russia's military and props up Russia's military, you can be sanctioned. And that's a pretty big threat. So can secondary sanctions be used against other sectors? I would think so. Somebody asked, thank you, Mitch, for this question. Is there appetite in the US government and also in European governments to expand and enforce secondary sanctions? I think there is. 2 years after this war, we're still gradually ratcheting up pressure, and secondary sanctions are a big wrench. Is that the right term? A big wrench to ratchet up pressure against Russia and its facilitators. So, Pavel, what do you think about secondary sanctions? Is this something that's going to be an effective tool?
Yes, the short answer is definitely yes, and we can already see that it's critical for some of the companies and countries. Basically, we can see how the UAE were removed from the gray list, the FATF gray list recently, after actually being gray listed in I think something like March 2022, just after the beginning of the war, and many of the Russian money flowing into the country, and the UAE definitely being used as a transition area for some of the goods and even services provided by different countries, including European countries. I've seen some of those in our reports, and I believe that this tour of US and European officials around the Middle East and including the UAE has had its impact. And I believe the UAE actually realized, and I hope this will be the case with many other countries, that the benefits of not trading with Russia and helping it circumvent sanctions is much higher than doing the opposite, and they have a future Russia doesn't. So I think that this is one of the impacts of the secondary sanctions.
Good.
In a sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And like I said, they're a very powerful threat. So another question from Matthew: if Russia operates outside of the US dollar financial system, how do US-led sanctions remain effective, or what needs to change to make them more effective? So I will say this, that Russia is desperately trying to get around restrictions and gain access to the US dollar and to the global financial system. And we need to remember that the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And even Treasury Secretary Yellen, I think it was yesterday or the day before, said, look, that's not going to change anytime soon. So when you don't have access to the world's reserve currency, you also don't have access to the global financial system. That said, once again, we need to remember that we don't have a comprehensive embargo on Russia. What we have is specific banks and financial institutions that are blocked from the US dollar and from the global financial system and have been booted out of SWIFT, right? So, I think they're still effective. Russia is trying to operate outside of the US dollar, but as Pavel, you mentioned a few minutes ago, I mean, they can't use the rupees, and India wants to pay them in rupees to sell oil or to buy their oil, and they're like, we can't do anything with this, right? So I think as long as the dollar remains the world's reserve currency, I think we will definitely still see sanctions being effective. Let's see. So this is an interesting question from Simon. What does the panel think should be the penalty for companies which have aided and abetted Putin's violent kleptocratic state? For example, well documented vast flows of funds from Western oil companies right up to and right after the start of war. I'm going to pitch that one over to you, my friend.
I'm not a prosecutor, not a judge, but I think that the mechanism could be something similar to FCPA penalties, something similar to these, anti-corruption issues. So when you have a fine, basically, you don't sanction the company, because if you start sanctioning every company, you'll have no companies left to work with. So it's also a strategic, national strategic interest not to have all those your own domestic companies, sanctioned. So I think the fine mechanism should be introduced, and as I said, just something similar to the FCPA related fines.
Well, okay. Okay. Andrew asked an interesting question, and this one's actually in your wheelhouse. So I'm gonna ask you this: how many cases can human-based intelligence cover out of global sanctions and evasion volumes? Is it 1%? Is it 3%? Is it 10%? Like, how helpful can humans be?
Well, a very good question. Actually, this is look, human is a part of the enhanced due diligence procedure, usually applied to high-risk third parties, right? So it depends on how many of those high-risk third parties you have among your overall volume of third parties. So it can be any percent depending on your type of operations, the criteria you apply to naming the company or designating the company as high risk. So it really depends on your system. How many percent can be covered? I have no idea. Haven't calculated. It's I think it's again different from industry to industry, from company to company involved in this as a source, for example, of the product. But I would approach this not in a quantitative aspect, but rather qualitative. So you could outline the red flags that are relevant to the sanction circumvention, and based on that, you can build your approach to enhanced due diligence on your third parties. We can, by the way, this is a very good question, and I mean, Nicki, if anyone can or would like to proceed with discussing this later, feel free to share my contact, because this is a crucial thing. We're debating on this both on a corporate level and the sanctions policy community. So this is something that can be developed further.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I consider human to be invaluable. But as I mentioned a long time ago, I think to you, is that, when you're dealing with humans, you also have to characterize your sources. So when I was working for the US government, we'd get these reports in and we'd say this source has firsthand access, or the source has secondhand access through a reliable first-hand source, or we would say this source has reported reliably in the past, but we also think that their purpose is to influence and not just to inform. So looking at the human sources, looking at whom they're related to, have they reported reliably in the past? Have they, might they have another agenda for giving you the information? That's also really, really important. But yeah, Pavel is right, because human is part of a bigger picture. It's part of a bigger ecosystem, whether we're talking about open source, whether we're talking about databases. You can go into Russia's egg roll and look up corporate documents, right? Whether it's intercepts, whether it's anything like that, it's part of a larger ecosystem. And it is important because you'll have people out there who are on the ground, who have had experience and who can give you additional insights.
Just a quick note as well, just to add to what Nicki just said. The method you apply, like humanity is also different, right? In the government sector, when for example, the intelligence agencies, they have a totally different approach to human sources work. They need assets which they work with for a long time, right? Like we call them warm sources, basically people you resort to, experts in the industry you resort to from time to time. But there is a huge amount of information that at least we get through so-called cold sources that you might talk to them once in your life. And there could be 30 sources like that for a case. But then out of those 30 cases, you will have just 30 sources, you will have just maybe 6 to 7 relevant, solid comments that you would use in your report, and those would give you the real meat, and the rest would just provide auxiliary information, supportive kind of data. So it's a whole method, and you shouldn't necessarily talk face to face to a source. It's also a method. I mean, I can talk hours about this, but it's
I love listening to you talk hours about this too, because it's kind of my baby, I'm going to ask one more question because I know we're really running over time here. More than happy to field some of these questions, after the fact. If you'd like to email us, we can certainly ping you the contact information. Can the oil cap price be reduced to $30 or lower? So that's something that the McFall-Yermak group actually recommended. But they also said that maybe it's a good idea to kind of reduce it gradually. When the $60 cap was imposed, Russians basically were like, well, we're not going to ship oil to you. Well, guess what? You're still shipping oil. But there are other things that, that can happen that we can do to enforce that cap first. And I think, especially from the OFAC side, we're really starting to target those particular entities, the vessels, the ghost fleet. There were reports about Gabon's ship registry being used by the Russian ghost fleet to re-register its vessels so that they can continue shipping oil above the cap, right? So I would guess, I don't know, but I would absolutely guess that conversations are going on with Gabon right now about, hey, guess what? Your registry is being used to evade the price cap. You need to do something about that, because we've started targeting some of these different companies and vessels. We just sanctioned, put Sovcomflot on the SDM list. We identified 14 ships as blocked property. People were asking, well, why not more? There are specific, evidentiary standards that we need to meet in order to identify blocked company and blocked property in order to sanction a company. But we're working toward that. As you can see, there's already been 3 OFAC actions this year alone in the past 2 months that focus on enforcement of the price cap. There's been multiple guidance. So before we start talking about lowering it, which again is a recommendation, and that's something that's probably a possibility, we should look at better enforcement of the current price cap. Anything to add to that?
Well, not on my end. I'm not really an energy expert, so this requires really calculations, understanding of how the Middle Eastern kingdoms deal with their oil production. So I'd rather pass this one.
Okay, No problem. I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
Thanks.
And guys, we really, really appreciate the influx of questions. I know we're way over time. And again, if you have specific questions for me or for Pavel, we are certainly happy to give you our email, our contact information, so you can actually ask those questions. I know there's a bunch we didn't answer, and I am sorry about that. Next time we'll make this thing 2 hours. I don't know, but I really want to, Pavel, I wanted to thank you for joining me this morning. This has been truly an honor and really, really interesting for me as well.
Thank you, Nicki, and it's always great talking to you. And thanks for sharing your expertise. I'll just, I love approaching you for advice, and thanks a lot. And you're doing a lot for this effort. And thanks for supporting my country.
Anytime. Thank you so much. Lauren, any closing housekeeping?
Yes. Thank you, Nicki and Pavel, both of you, for taking the time to answer our questions and, share your insights with us. And we want to thank everyone again for joining. And to all those that did submit questions, feel free to reach out separately if yours wasn't answered. We hope you gained value from our discussion today. Please expect a follow-up email in a bit, including a link to access the recording, as well as early access to a new report we've published on the 2-year anniversary. And we hope you will be able to join us again in the future for another discussion. And thank you all again for your time.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.